So good morning again, everyone. I'm John Fitzgerald from SCVO, and I'm delighted to be launching our digital call to action report as part of Digital Leaders Week this morning. So as I say, I'm going to start off by presenting some of the key themes in that report, and then we're going to open up to questions and Q&A afterwards. And we'll aim to spend most of the time together this morning with a Q&A and discussion, because I know that a lot of you have a huge amount of expertise within your own organizations, and we'd really love to hear about that as well. So without further ado, I'm just going to share screen and get going. So the report we're launching today is our call to action for a digitally confident voluntary sector. Now, this is actually our third report along these lines. We did a report back in 2016 and another one in 2018. And this time we're launching it in 2022 as we start to emerge from the pandemic. And what we're doing really is thinking about how the context has changed for organizations and what this means for digital as we move ahead. So as I say, I'm just going to go through and highlight some key themes from this report, and then I'd like to open up a Q&A because I'm sure that a lot of you have expertise to share too. So if you wanted the report in 3 sentences, it's basically that the pandemic is still changing everything. Organizations have made amazingly quick progress in the most challenging of circumstances. And the question we're thinking about right now is how might we embed these changes for long term and make a lasting impact. So that change in context, I think some of it will be very familiar to you, but I'll just go over it. The pandemic, it's not finished yet, although for a fair few of us, life feels quite normal again and we're doing things that we did before the pandemic. It's still with us and it's still affecting our lives. And a lot of the long-term impacts of the pandemic, people who lost their lives and people whose health has been really affected, and the various restrictions we've all experienced, they're going to stay with us for a long time. So that's a really difficult context in which to be doing work as a voluntary organisation, even though it's been a bit of a catalyst for more digital change. Secondly, climate change, it's the issue of our generation. And we're now in the decade where we need to achieve net zero if we're to achieve it at all. And digital can help with this. So the obvious example is that travel emissions, if you're running events and getting a lot of people traveling to physical events, that potentially has quite a significant climate impact, but moving that activity online can make a real saving in terms of carbon emissions. Having said that, it's worth noting that digital and technology is not emission-free. The carbon footprint of the internet is about the same as the global airline industry. And also think about things like smartphones, which can very quickly become out of date. The average smartphone, 80% of its lifetime emissions have occurred before you've unboxed it, before you've even started using it. So there's a real need within the technology space to make sure that the way we deliver solutions is sustainable and not requiring a lot of use of natural resources and generating a lot of waste. The third theme is racial justice and anti-racism and movements like Black Lives Matter. This has acquired much more prominence in recent years, although of course the issues have been with us for decades and centuries. And I think in this context, digital can be a huge enabler. It can give marginalized communities a voice and allow people to share their testimony and challenge injustice. But on the other hand, we need to be really careful with technology, because if we use data in the wrong way, we can end up encoding bias and creating more injustice rather than addressing it. And at the same time, the teams that work on technology and digital solutions need to be really careful to make sure that they're a diverse team, that they're open to diverse perspectives, so that they design solutions that are suitable for everyone and not throwing up additional barriers to people that are already discriminated against. The cost of living crisis, I'm sure, is at the front of everyone's minds. And in an organizational context, that presents a kind of triple whammy, because firstly, it creates a lot more pressure on services. For a lot of organizations, there's much more demand for the kind of help that they offer. Secondly, the cost of delivering those services potentially goes up. But thirdly, budgets don't increase. And also, if a lot of your income is coming from voluntary donations, that's potentially going to reduce the income that you have available. So a massively challenging context. And within that context, it can be really hard to think about how might you make a long-term investment in digital. So lots of volatile and challenging context out there. If I was to sum them up in a word, I would say there's been lots of change. It's maybe hard to work out what's going to happen next, but we just need to be ready for those challenges and those external constraints. And reflecting on all that change, the next question we've got really is, well, what does this mean for digital? So what we're saying as the overarching vision in this report is that any organization should be able to use digital well to boost its capability and help people. And to put that in a more concrete way for 2022, we're saying that we want to see the very best of what people have been able to do in the pandemic and make that accessible right across the sectors. So we've all seen amazing new ways of working and strategies and techniques by not just big organizations, but small ones as well. And it would be fantastic if that became a default right across the sector so that every organization can make use of those new ways of working that we've discovered. To get to that vision, we've got 5 key ambitions, and I've got them here together in one slide, but I'm about to go into them in a bit more detail. So first of all, it has to be for everyone. Secondly, the voluntary sector need to be canny investors. Thirdly, digital needs to be embedded and happening every day. Fourthly, skills are critical to this. And finally, whatever we do in terms of digital technology needs to be secure by design and used in a responsible way. So I'm going to go through those now in a bit more depth. So what do we mean when we say it's for everyone? Well, really what we mean is the work that we do on digital technology needs to be user-centered. We need to use the best techniques from service design and user research so that we can ensure that whatever we're developing is responsive to people's context and their daily lives. So there's no point building things which don't fit in with the way people need to lead their lives. So it's really important to do that. And I think the voluntary sector are actually quite good at doing informal user research, but there is a need to do it in a more disciplined and rigorous way to make sure that new solutions we develop really work with people's needs and context. And a kind of quick practical observation on this is sometimes user research can lead you to realize that you don't need a technical solution. So maybe you're offering a one-to-one counseling service. It might be a large proportion of your users can carry on doing that on a digital channel, but there may be people who just need contact by phone. So you need to be ready to adapt and fine-tune things according to everyone's needs. Our second theme is about the need to be canny investors. So what we mean here is being strategic and wise. And so obviously the first way to be strategic is invest in the right stuff. So again, that draws back to user research and working out what's really needed to make an impact. Then, of course, you need to make sure you're investing in things that are fit for purpose. And there's a big challenge here because I think when you're procuring technology and investing in it, it's often something you don't really understand right across the organization. So a couple of the strategies we'd suggest to organizations in this context is find out what organizations of a similar size are doing. There's resources out there like Catalyst service recipes, which are a library of basically recipes or ideas that you can reuse for your own context. Another way of approaching it is to test and learn on a really small scale. And what we're calling on funders to do is to be supportive of that. Funders are very good at supporting fully fledged delivery of projects, but they need to get better at delivering pilots and experiments so that an organization might try something for a few months and maybe discover it's not actually that effective as a solution, but they still get the resource to do the testing and learning. And then that means that whatever they do in the longer term is proven and meets some real user needs out there in the real world. The other thing I'd just quickly say in this context is technology and digital platforms are getting more affordable and pricing is getting more transparent as well. So I think a lot of us are probably using subscription-based services like Office 365 or Zoom or Google Workspace. And those give a really good model because you can scale them up and down quite quickly. And it means you can have more capability, but without a massive upfront investment in building something for yourself. The next theme we've got is about embedding digital. And what we mean by this is not necessarily turning your whole organization into digital experts or massive enthusiasts for it, but making sure everybody in all parts of the organization have good awareness of digital. And the reason why that's important is if a frontline worker has good digital awareness, they can start to reflect on ways they're doing stuff and wonder if digital could help them improve it. And equally, it's really important on the development and design side that you don't have a techie team hived off into a separate silo somewhere. It's really important that the team that are doing the technical work are connected to the users who are going to use it. And a really healthy way of doing that is embedding digital right through, so that it's not we're going to pass this to a technical team and we don't really know what they do. It's really about having a much more open conversation across the organization. And we also talk here about digital being a daily occurrence, so not just something that happens as a one-off when everything is right, but also just something that you're doing on a more routine basis in your day-to-day work. That's really important because it means that the whole organization can progress and grow together rather than one small part of the business becoming quite digital and other parts being left behind. Very much related to this, the need for skills has been critical in the pandemic, and I think we're still seeing that. We see organizations really looking to hire people with new skills, and we also see, so many of us will have had that experience in the pandemic of, how do you do a breakout room in Zoom, or how do you share a document online in a safe way? And there's this myriad of things we've had to get to grips with quite quickly. And, what's been positive, I think, is people have done it by and large. They've, really gone on a massive learning curve and picked up loads of things very quickly. That's been great to see. But there's a need to keep doing this. What we're able to do today isn't the end of digital. We're going to need to be able to learn more new stuff. And so at one level, it's about getting those basic practical skills in place. So one way we did that in the pandemic was we partnered with Microsoft, who delivered thousands of free training places to the voluntary sector. It's been hugely popular. And my colleague Maddie, who works in our training team with me in digital as well, has done loads and loads of courses, and we've been amazed at the demand for that. We did think at various points that, well, there's so much pressure on organizations. Do they really have time to learn new stuff? And the answer is people want to learn new stuff all the time. Now, going back to what this means for organizations, I think there's a need to kind of carve out space and a bit of resource to make sure this keeps happening. And I think for funders as well, there's a need to recognize that keeping skills up to date is a really important part of organizations staying capable and effective. And as I say, those can be quite basic skills, like using popular platforms like Office 365, where they can be more advanced into how do you work with a service designer, or how do you procure a team to do an accessible website, and more complex challenges like that. The last theme I'm highlighting this morning is the need for things to be secure by design. So the good news is that modern digital platforms are pretty secure by and large. They've got a lot of features there to help us use them safely, but we still need to be responsible users. So if you think about the fact that maybe before the pandemic, you might have been delivering a lot of your activity face-to-face, you might have had so many meetings now that have been online. That generates a huge digital footprint. So it's really important to make sure that this is held securely and you're looking after the people that you're supporting, and also within a team context as well. Online collaboration is fantastic, but you do need to be on top of things like your user management and your password policies and that kind of thing to make sure you're not making yourself much more vulnerable. So that's a kind of theme which is, it's not one we want to scare people with, but we do want people to be using digital tools responsibly so that organizations don't get compromised by hackers and people's details and data doesn't get breached. So that's my last theme. I'm going to just remind you again of all of the 5 themes. It's for everyone. Be canny investors, embed digital, skills are critical and secure by design. The report, as I say, is on our website. I'm going to pop a link to it in chat in a second, but it's now time to go to a bit of Q&A and discussion. I know I've been kind of talking at you for 10 minutes or so I hope that that's prompted some questions. And I'd just like to move open to chat now. So the first kind of things I'd like the group to reflect on is about, first of all, the biggest positive digital development you saw in your organization during the pandemic, and what was the impact of that? And then we can move on to think about challenges. So I'm going to stop sharing now so we can see the room and have a bit of discussion. I need to enable people to, so you can unmute yourself if you want to just talk, but also if you want to fire a question into chat. please feel free. I know that those of you who are regular attendees at DigiShift will feel really comfortable just jumping in with chat. If you're expecting a kind of webinar style thing, it may feel a bit more proactive, but please jump in and maybe share about a really positive digital development you saw in your organization during the pandemic. If maybe I should have got people to post about where they're from right at the start. That was the trick I missed, because often that encourages people to just get using chat. Is anyone at all willing to share about something that, and it could be something quite trivial as well. It just doesn't need to be like a massive big thing that changed, but maybe something that surprised you that you thought, I wasn't sure we are going to be able to do this, but we did, and it worked out okay. Is anyone willing to chip in on that?
Hi, John.
Hi.
I'm Danica, and if you can probably tell by the accent, I'm from Australia.
Hello.
Thanks for the report. Absolutely wonderful. I think the organisation that I work for, which actually I started partway through the pandemic, so I left a corporate and came to a social enterprise. I think our organisation learnt that they can not have to be in the office all the time. And for them, it was quite a realization. So we obviously use the Microsoft Office suite and use Teams a lot. So now it's very second nature, and to the point where my team as stakeholder development managers all go out and do face-to-face. There's a little bit more now that does over Zoom and or Teams, and that's more of a first step. And then going face-to-face is almost second step. So I think that would be the change that I've seen in our organisation.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks for tipping off. Yeah, and I think you're right that idea that teams can work from anywhere is massively empowering. I think it means if you're a frontline worker out in the community, it maybe means you can do some contact with people you're supporting, but then also be in touch with your office. But the other really interesting I think we've seen in Scotland is it really opens up recruitment in quite a big way, because historically, a lot of organisations are concentrated in the central belt like Edinburgh and Glasgow. And if you were somewhere quite remote like the Borders or in the far north, you might have felt, well, there's certain jobs that are going to be tricky for me to take because I don't really want to move to the big smoke. So I think that's, a really interesting change. Jack's posted a really interesting question or reflection about some organisations with less technology are maybe now going back the way and using less digital. Do you want to say any more about that, Jack, or he's still with us? Yeah. I don't know if you want to chip in and talk a bit more about it. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, you're hearing me okay?
Yes, fine, thank you.
There's one outfit I know a little bit about at the moment, local to me, and it appears that the board and some subgroups, as it were, prefer to meet in person, and there's a sort of feeling that when they're under control of Zoom or Teams, there's some sort of animal that is controlling their lives much more. And when they're now face to face across a table, it's a totally different scenario.
Okay, that's really, and do you think that's to do with the amount of meetings that people have or the tempo of meetings as they have a discussion?
I wonder if it's much deeper than that, actually, whether some of the people have got into roles that they're not really capable of. The particular group I'm talking about operates more as a chamocracy than a proper charity.
Yeah. So you mean it's like making the discussion more formal than it might be if it was just around a table in a church hall?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It is interesting. And I think one of the kind of funny things about Zoom and meetings is it's nearly like a physical meeting, but it's not quite the same. And it's quite a challenge. I think if you've got teams that are used to using it, it can work really well and people really appreciate the time saving. I know I've got an aunt who's down in East Anglia, and she is like the least techie person I've ever known. She's very involved with their church committee, and she said, well, actually, I quite like the idea of not having to go out on a wet Thursday night to a church committee and for her, it's been a positive, but I can also see that there are some discussions that are going to be easier to do in person. So I'm seeing a couple of questions just popping into chat. I don't know, Sarah Clark, do you want to jump in with your question about keep making things accessible? Hello.
Hello, hi everybody. I'm Sarah from Charity Comms. It's nice to be here. Brilliant report, really interesting. So obviously we work a lot with other charities as well, and we put on a lot of events. So for us, it's been really a short learning curve, like for everyone, particularly at the start of the pandemic, to try and get everything online. But we find it really made things a lot more accessible because we used to be very London centric. So it made it really difficult for people, especially from Scotland, to come down for a day or a meeting or a conference. So we've had, I think it's about an 18 or 20% increase in attendees since we've gone online, which has been really good to see. And people have said it's, a lot more accessible. I think there is that feeling starting to come that people want to be back in person to a certain extent, to network and, recreate. It's really difficult to recreate that networking and that connection that you do get in person online. So we totally appreciate that. But the other thing, just from a kind of personal team point of view as well, is that I think it's been really good because we've really tried to encourage everyone to have informal coffee meetups online with people they might not work with day to day, because there's the people in your organization that you would chat to, you need to work with, you need to collaborate on certain things, but other people that you might not need to do that. And in the office, you might have, bumped into them in the kitchen or gone and had lunch. So we've all tried to really make an effort to do that, to sort of keep that connection and get to know what everybody does. And that's been really, really nice. And when it was homeschooling, there's like 4 of us are mums. So we had a little kind of support group to kind of get us all through it together. So I think you can find ways to keep that connection. But again, I really like being in person with people as well. So it's just kind of finding that balance, really, I think.
Yeah, I think that theme you mentioned of kind of learning and networks has been huge. I think our chief exec at the end of 2020 described it as, in the pandemic, we've been everywhere and we've been nowhere. So it was like we've all stayed in our own homes quite a lot of the time, but we've been able to connect with really wide networks. And our own experience on DigiShift was this is our 57th episode, and we had experts from around the world were able to join us. And if we'd been doing it on a face-to-face basis, that would have been pretty hard to organise. We couldn't have got people from the States or from London to come up to Scotland just for a short session, but we were able to do that. So it was a big benefit. But I also agree that what you said, Sarah, about that need to be like quite mindful about it, because I think if you're in an office, you can just bump into somebody and have a random chat, but you need to like organize it a wee bit online, which can be challenging. Steph, I wonder if you want to talk a wee bit about your experience with Google Workspace and G Suite that we are with you.
Yeah, we were really kind of fortunately or foreshadowing switched to Google Suite just before the pandemic hit, and we have services all over the UK, and it was quite fortuitous for us because all the staff had been trained just before we went into lockdown, and we support people with substance use issues who we had to switch a lot of our meetings and a lot of our face-to-face either to on the telephone or to a video call. A lot of the work that we were doing was upskilling service users and staff to feel confident about being able to access this. And one of the best bits of feedback that we got was from people who would never have attended a meeting in person and never experienced that in-person support, that group support that they could have had because of their confidence, because of some of the mental health, but being able to actually do it virtually for the safety of their own home was a massive difference from them. One of the things that we're exploring just now is just how do we make sure that everybody who accesses our service can be upskilled, and we're not just relying on internal staff for that as well.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because I can imagine that it's really important to make sure people have the skills, but that's quite time consuming if that's an extra thing that your staff team have to do on top of the other support that they're offering. And very fortunate, as you say, that you're onto G Suite and Google Workspace. Got a question from Catherine. Do you want to jump in?
Hi there. I feel a bit like an imposter here, but Steph, what you had to say was really interesting for what I'm doing. I've been doing some freelance work in the third sector, but actually I'm here in the capacity of someone who's writing a dissertation. I have a previous career in international electronic publishing and digital supply chains, so that's kind of informing this. But I'm writing a master's dissertation on looking at the third sector, small charities, through the lens of personal data rights, privacy and protection. And actually, I was really wanting to get some input from John to kind of sanity check on where I think things might be going. But everybody here would be fantastic to talk to. And of course, I'm also looking for research subjects, but I'm not gonna hustle now. But I kind of have two questions which sort of overlap. Do you think that third sector organisations will welcome the new data reform bill, or sigh and dread another change, or just be unaware of it? The question.
Yeah.
A bit more kind of blue sky. Do you foresee, and if so, in what time frame, a move from a top-down defensive protection model of data management to a bottom-up user-centered rights model, for example, through an intermediary data trust layer?
Really good questions. I'm not going to pretend I can answer on behalf of everyone, so if somebody feels different, feel free. On the new bill, I think unaware would probably be a fair assessment. I think for loads of organizations, the advent of GDPR was a big kind of pivot point, but a lot of organizations felt, right, we've got to kind of get all this done and then we can just carry on with what we need to do. I think a particular like practical factor right now is I think a lot of organizations will have switched on new services to keep the work going. And like we talk about digital duct tape, which is actually a phrase from a report called the Glimmers report. And, you know, if you're there in March or April 2020 and you've got to do something to make a service work, you will do things in quite an agile way. And we were really pleased to see that, because at the end of the day, organizations need to be able to do the work they need to do. But things may not have gone through the kind of rigorous privacy assessment you might expect them to do. You know, as a really quick example, you're registering people for Zoom meetings. Are you handling that data? I would think lots of organizations did think that through and work it out, but they wouldn't necessarily have generated a big, you know, update on a policy to say, here's how we use this service, here's how we use that service. So I do feel there's probably a need for a catch up. I do think, you know, I don't think organizations are using things irresponsibly. I think it's just kind of making sure that whatever policies and procedures they have written down have caught up with the way things are happening right now. On the new legislation, I think, yeah, that's probably quite far down the track of people's, and I think one reason why GDPR was quite a big one was it was a really big shift, you know, that moved things to quite a different place. And that was, you know, there was a bit of a lead up and a run up to that. So that helped. Whereas this, I think, is going to be a bit more confusing. You also asked, what was the second question about?
Whether you foresee a move from a top-down protection.
Oh yes, to a kind of, yeah. So I think that's a really good model. I guess the problem is it requires a lot of interoperability. So I think most organizations are well geared to handle a kind of, we're holding some data. If somebody asks us or challenges about it, we can either give a brief, here's what the privacy policy says, or share some data back with an individual if that's what they need to see. I think handling a kind of a federated user-driven data store is going to be technically more challenging. But I do think one really interesting thing in our digital checkup service that we run is we get organizations to do an online self-assessment of their digital capability, and about a third of organizations don't have a CRM at all, which is a bit surprising to me, but there is. So I think what that says, if you're being optimistic, is if a new system or model came into place, organizations could pick that up because they maybe don't have their own big system running at the moment.
My hunch that
Yeah.
some people may jump straight from paper into an intermediary federated trust without having to develop their own.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think the other thing we saw in the pandemic was organizations didn't have a kind of monolithic CRM, but they might have 2 or 3 services running, each of which would have contained some data. So I think the long-term need there is about how do you make sense of all that? How do you use it responsibly, but also do it in a way that is effective? Nicola, you got a question?
Yeah, sorry, it's a completely different topic change.
That's fine.
I want to pick brains as well. As you can see, that I work for Shetland Library, which isn't really a charitable organisation, but we're heavily involved with the Community Learning and Development Partnership, which encompasses a lot of the voluntary organisations in Shetland, and also we have volunteers working for us ourselves. Most of our staff now have been back in the office since June 2020, because we do primarily provide a frontline service, but obviously we've still got a lot of folk, and even now still got a lot of vulnerable people who are still not comfortable coming outside, and we're still trying to get to them. But how, in what other people's experiences, we still have this difficulty with getting to people who do not already have that digital access, digital know-how. How are other people managing to get to those people who are still feeling quite vulnerable, still at home, but don't have the digital access? We were involved with the Connecting Scotland project and got devices and stuff out to people, but it's like, how do we find those other people that we're missing? And I'd be really keen to hear on other people's experiences with that.
That's a really great question. Shirley, I saw you waving. Was that a question, or was it waving at a colleague? No. Okay. So on that question of, people that are persistently not online for various reasons and yet still wanting to connect remotely. So how do we reach those people? Maybe while people are thinking a wee bit, one thing we kept advising organizations to do in the pandemic, particularly in the early frantic months, was think about the total list of people you've normally worked with. So like your total kind of user base, or all the people that have been coming to online or face-to-face activity before, and do a sense check. Because what we found was people were amazed at how much engagement they were seeing for digital activity, be that a kind of an online meeting or some kind of discussion or an email bulletin. The engagement was really fantastic, but it would be quite easy to be distracted by that and say, this is working really well. And then there might be 20% of your historic service users who are just there and not so in touch. So we felt that was a really important kind of sense check to do, to say, how do the two groups measure up? Shirley, you have got a question. Go for it.
Yes, I have got one now. And it's sort of related to what we've just said. I work for Hearts and Minds, small charity based in Edinburgh, and we run programmes called Clown Doctors and Elderflowers that go into hospitals and hospices and SEN schools for children and work with people with dementia. So when the lockdowns restrictions happened, we couldn't do any of that because all of it was in person on site. And we were desperate to sort of keep meeting these people because we knew this would be really difficult. A lot of the children were shielding, etc., and really cut off. So we went online, which was a huge challenge because we'd never done anything like that before. And it wasn't without problems, and the artists who are all mainly theatre artists, they found that quite difficult at first, doing the visits online via Zoom or Teams or whatever. However, over the months, it really developed, and we built up really good relationships with the organisations that we were working with, like Chaz and some of the schools, and the staff there were really helpful because they were desperate to sort of try and keep this connection going for all their residents, etc. And the success of it has been that even now that we're sort of back on site, although it's taken a long time, but over the last 6 to 8 months, we've managed to get back on site, not to all, but to some of the places. we're still actually now doing a hybrid model. And even with Chas, we've only just started going back into Rachel and Robin House in person. They've still asked us to, they've put a room aside where we go and do online visits with children that are at home that can't come into the actual hospice and are maybe quite remote. And we also now visit a school in Inverness online that we used to visit years ago, but then we lost funding and travel expenses were just so much. So now we're doing digital visits with the classes up there. And we also run some workshops online for carers. And we've been part of some work with University of West Scotland connections, etc., with dementia care. And we've been part of something called Rights Made Real, where we've offered elderflower visits to care homes for people with dementia, and they're set up online. Now, it sounds great. One of the ones we found real difficulty with was trying to do Clown Doctors online in hospitals, because just the firewalls, get the staff having the time, so it's not been perfect, and we're still trying to work out a lot of things, but it has made us change how we work and how we think about it, and has given us this possibility to extend our reach to more remote parts of Scotland, whereas before it was maybe Central Belt with the odd visit up to Inverness or Aberdeen. So it's been really challenging, but there's a lot of positives that have come out of it.
Yeah, that's great. And interesting, I think, that you're persisting with some of it, even as things become more possible face to face. I think one of the big challenges is like making that choice of what you do. Like one thing we faced ourselves is normally DigiShift has been online only. That's worked really well for us. It's become a format that people are really comfortable with. We initially launched this report face to face at the Gathering last week. So that was an in-person event. And that was really exciting, but we did get challenged. People said, well, why wasn't it hybrid? And our kind of answer at that point was, well, within that context of a big exhibition centre in a room for 1 hour, it was quite challenging to do it well, and we wouldn't want to do it in a way that was not effective. And we also knew that we had this event coming straight afterwards, so we knew that that would be a way to reach it. But it's, I think, particularly in small organizations, you can do one thing really well at a time, but it's quite hard to have two different modes of delivery going on because they make quite different demands. Any other quick reflections? We've obviously talked quite a bit about face-to-face versus online meetings, and we talked a wee bit. I've got Nicola, do you want to come back in again?
Yeah, I was just going to say about the online versus face-to-face and the blended. I mean, we've been up in Shetland. It's always quite difficult for anything that's down in the Central Belt, which most library stuff does seem to be. The travelling for us is quite prohibitive. So it's been really good, actually, that a lot of the meetings that we would attend normally as a library service have gone online, and we've been able to attend those. Now that things are starting to go back to face-to-face, we have found ourselves now out of the loop again, because we can't afford that travel fees down to the Central Belt, and also down to some of our stuff is actually down in Essex and Birmingham, some of the folk that we use. So yeah, it's kind of pluses and minuses. I love a face-to-face meeting. I must admit, I've got a face-to-face meeting this afternoon that will be heading up for. But yeah, has been quite a lot of advantages to doing meetings on Teams and on Zoom as well. We've been able to be more involved simply because of distance and cost.
Great. Richard, I might take you next because you got your hand up and we've not heard from you before. Go ahead.
Just sort of really focusing on your second bullet point, and one, can you hear me?
Yes, fine, yeah.
About challenges, and one thing that wasn't in your in the list of things that you went through is the challenge really of organizations having enough time to do this work. And I'd just like to share a story of a piece of work I over the last few years with I'm London based. I'm a digital consultant based in London, but I've been working with a Scottish charity that probably falls in the, depending on your categorization, sort of small to medium size, and helping them I don't normally do fundraising, but I got involved with it, helping them implement the fundraising system. And the biggest challenge really has been that is, despite me having a large number of conversations with them about the scale of work that would be involved in moving to or implementing a fundraising system, their expectations, and particularly management expectations of what they could achieve with the resources they had versus what they have been able to achieve, has been, there was a big gap there. And it's the term I've started to use is about looking at your capacity to exploit. You can look at these systems and they have lots of capabilities, but to actually implement them and implement the changes around them takes a lot of time. And I helped them choose the system, and then left them and the supplier to get on with it. And it really just ran into a lot of problems. So I'm back doing a combination. They found a bit of money, and I'm doing a lot of pro bono work, and we're taking it one bite at a time. But it is and I think we've set some realistic expectations about how long it's going to take. But I think in terms of your role, I think also being realistic about and particularly communicating to management about the staff resource and skills that you'll need within the organization to, if you are going to be making these sorts of changes, in my view, but others may disagree, that that this does take a significant investment of staff time and looking at staff skills, and whether you need to bring in somebody with the right sort of skills to do this work or to support. I mean, I agree with you. You don't want siloed sort of digital skills, but at the same time, just leaving your existing, in this case, fundraising staff to do the work. They have really, really, really struggled with this. We are getting there, but it's taking a long time.
Sure. That's a really great point, Richard. And I think one thing that really struck me forcibly at the beginning of the pandemic was Maddie and I worked on Digital Evolution, as we call it, for probably about 4 or 5 years. And pre the pandemic, a message we kept on having to repeat is, digital is beneficial, give it a try, it's not too scary, you can get going. So we're spending a lot of time just trying to make the broader swathe of charities aware of the benefits and willing to give it a go. And then, of course, overnight, everybody wanted to be digital yesterday. And I think, the huge positive we saw there is, people picked up tools and they found ways of working and they made things happen. But we're aware that that was quite a special time, really. It was a kind of time of necessity where everybody was focused and we need to make something work. And we, outside the organization, service users were maybe more willing to try new stuff than they would have been before. But I think also, if you were to look at the kind of the big landscape of what you can do with digital, a lot of the wins that people had were kind of straightforward ones. It was setting up an online platform, or kind of, getting people to come to an online meeting or use a service that's quite easy to use. But the kind of deeper work of longer term change, I think that's where we place an emphasis on service design and user needs and investment and embedding it. Is like, that's where you're going to need to commit to over a longer time. And one soundbite that I forgot to say when I ran through the slides was, there's no done with digital. And you can be pessimistic about that and say, well, that means we're never going to do it. But you can also say, well, that actually means that what we've got today will be better in the future. So there's no need to kind of say we're going to achieve whatever state we want to in digital and then stop. You're going to keep building on it and modifying it as you go along. And I think quite a few senior managers and chief execs sometimes think, well, let's do digital for a bit and then we'll do something else. And I think that is potentially a mistake, because you need to have some capacity over the longer term to do it. And we got a fantastic discussion going on in chat. So Dave Gardner, I don't know, Dave, you want to say anything more about your comment, but you talked about, I wonder how much digital is too much, which I think is a really interesting question. Does that relate to people time on channels, or was it about organisational investments? To say a wee bit more.
So it's really, so I work for a national organisation. We've had Teams, well, I joined after COVID had kind of started, so Teams has been there as the main thing, but we've just brought in a more social media based communication tool. And I think for a lot of people, it's kind of muddied the waters of where should you have conversations and how, and there's not really been a process map, even though it's been asked for. So I think it's really, my question kind of stems from to kind of, you know, as we move into this hybrid era, what are the boundaries, and how would people kind of set those boundaries of what you should still be using digital for, what you should use different platforms for, and what you should maybe try and do in person, or, you know, let's be old fashioned to pick up the telephone if you can't talk in person.
Yeah, that's right. And I think loads of us probably in medium to bigger organizations will have that experience of there might be about 4 or 5 places you can go and check for stuff, and it can be quite overwhelming. So it's like thinking about, you know, how are we talking to each other? You know, if we were all back in the same physical office, it'd be very simple. You go and tap someone on the shoulder, or you would be in the same meeting room. And now it's and I also think, just on a very practical sense, people's calendars have become optimized for online meetings. So you're like, well, I could do 4 or 5 meetings a day, no problem. And then if you start to say, well, 2 of them are in person and one's in Stirling and one's in Glasgow, it's a very different kettle of fish. So I think we're still rethinking all that. Hannah, you talked about people being left behind. This is a kind of wholesale shift to digital. Do you want to say a wee bit more about that? Or just
Yeah, sure. So that's something that has been coming up quite a lot. Obviously, our project has been to try and deliver connectivity and training to people to learn how to use their devices. And that's been great, but so much of the feedback we've been getting from our members is that they really don't want those traditional kind of analog systems to go away, that it's really important that people can still, as you say, Lindsay, pick up the phone, call somebody, look up the yellow pages, whatever, to be able to go in and talk to somebody face to face. I think people feel really overwhelmed and disconcerted that the solution on an automated message is now download our app, or have a look online, make a booking online, you know, for the GP, things like this. So I as much as digital is really important to me, and that's obviously my project, I do really understand that disabled people, I mean, that's the community that we're working with, and I'm sure there's plenty of other people over Scotland, really want to be able to have options. And I think another thing that's just emerged in the last week that that actually caught me by surprise was somebody saying to us they needed some help to join Zoom on their phone. And I'd said to them, oh, but we've given you an iPad, so you should be able to join on that. And she said she stopped using the iPad because she's really scared about the cost of charging it with all the increased bills. And that really left me gobsmacked, because I hadn't quite seen that one coming. And an iPad is really inexpensive to charge. So I did some sums and had a look, and I think it's literally a couple of pounds a year to run. So even if energy costs double, kind of, we're not really looking at more than £5 a year. But for her, somebody who has to charge her electric wheelchair for 4 hours a day, she's really terrified that her bills are going to spiral out of control. And if something she can cut is the iPad, then she'll do it, even if it means she will become more digitally isolated and have to join meetings on a tiny phone and things like that. So that, I think, is another perspective for us to consider. That obviously I've been really aware of disabled people facing increasing bills, and obviously that's partly why we're giving them the kit and the connectivity with the MiFi and stuff. But people saying that they can't justify charging the device, that's a new one for me. And so I think that also reiterates, I suppose, why people need to be able to pick up the phone to make an appointment or speak to somebody, because they might not be using that expensive piece of equipment you've allocated them.
Yeah, that is a really interesting example, and really interesting that you had that conversation. Great that you're able to kind of give back a kind of piece of advice and say, don't worry, it's not too costly. I think one thing I remember right at the start of the pandemic, we had a week where probably like 10 or 20 organizations asked us how to move to virtual switchboards. So obviously a lot of organizations would have had a switchboard in their office. They needed their main contact number to keep working. And so it's actually quite easy to do. You can kind of switch to a switchboard in the cloud. So I think now a lot of organizations are doing it where somebody calls in, it comes through perhaps on Teams or whatever other platform you're using. And I think I would be an advocate of really making that phone number a quite important service that's there on your site. So somebody should be able to speak to a person in your team during working hours. And the advantage with a virtual system is you can share that around the team. You know, doesn't need to be one person who can never go on holiday or never leave their phone. You can make sure that that's supported through the organization, because I think it's such a good fallback and it meets that user expectation of, well, there's an organization here with people and I'd like to speak to a person in real time. You need to have that available. And it's something I would stress is like, whatever clever things you're doing on social media or on other channels, make sure those basic contact points are still effective, because that's often where people who are the most challenged are going to start with. So it's really important to do. We've got probably about 5 minutes left. Are there any other questions that anybody would like to chip in with? I've got another question for the room, if nobody else has got some. Oh, go for it, Catherine.
Yeah, this is a kind of maybe a newbie or a stupid question. When people in the third sector talk about digital, are they largely talking about external communications channels, possibly service provision through remote virtual means? And to what degree are people talking about internal operational systems, and in particular case management?
That's a good question. We could probably spend a whole call attempting to define digital. The definition that we like and use quite a lot is one by Tom Loosemore, which is digital is using the technologies, practices and approaches of the internet era to respond to people's raised expectations. And I think for me, that's a very kind of wordy one, but basically it means technology means we can do more, but it means people expect more as well. So it's about keeping up, you know, if people in their personal lives have a really good online retail experience, the experience they get from a charity in terms of advice should be as straightforward as that. And for me, it is both internal and external. And the reason why it covers both for me is a massive resource that organizations have is the time of their staff team. So anything you can do to free up time amongst your staff team will enable you to deliver more and do more activity. And I remember talking to an organization where they had a lot of counselors who did a lot of work, and they then needed to collect some stats and information on the meetings they'd had. And they were doing it manually, and we showed them a really simple way to do it with a shared spreadsheet, and it blew their mind because they said, well, this is saving us half a day a week. And that was from a quite senior person. So you can think about the value of getting half a day a week back. And there's loads of examples like that. There's maybe not so many now because organizations are doing more, but anything which helps people work more effectively is not really about delivering a financial saving, but it's about magnifying your impact. So it's both. And I think what is quite interesting is occasionally you can see organizations where they got something fantastic going on in terms of external delivery, but there might be something quite old school and quite problematic internally. So it's like, if you're a user outside, the charity might be like, well, they seem to be doing good things, but actually if you go and look at how their CRM works or particular bits of internal technology, they can be quite challenging.
Thank you. Yeah. This is grist to the mill. Anybody else wants to jump in and be prepared to talk to me, I'd be very pleased. Thank you. I might send you a follow-up email about this, John, if that's okay.
Of course, yeah, by all means. A couple of other questions I had in my mind that I want to throw out to the room was, first of all, what are you doing now that's new? So something that's coming up that's a new digital piece of activity for you. Or also, if there's nothing like that, what thing are you holding on to that was a new thing that you introduced in the last couple of years? I know we talked at the beginning of the Q&A about people maybe going back to more face-to-face delivery, but are there things you think that's definitely something we're going to keep because it's got long-term benefits? go for it, Nicola.
We've just, well, last year we applied for funding and have just received the equipment to put laptops, printers and iPads into our most remote community libraries. Those are ones in the way far North Isles that are remote to even us on mainland Shetland.
Yeah.
So, and that's really been in response to the fact that so much has gone online.
Yeah.
And connectivity, especially in the North Isles. Again, we don't have 2G, let alone 3, 4, 5G in a lot of places where we're at. So that's been quite a positive thing that actually equipment's actually going up tomorrow to be installed. So that'll give a good lot of extra service to the people in the most remote areas for us. So we're quite pleased that we've actually been able to secure that funding and get that in there.
That's really good. Dave, you got a hand?
Yeah, I kind of agree with the points made by Nicola. I think it depends on the service and what's being offered. I mean, a lot of the work that's done within my organisation is done face to face and kind of has to be done face to face because it's easier. I know that a lot of the clients that my colleagues work with have possibly struggled more.
Oh, I think we lost your sound a wee bit there, Dave. But you were talking about because the work necessarily has to be face to face, it's kind of heading back that way, even though you might have other tools available. Yeah. Good. Okay. So one interesting example, just picking up your point, Nicola, I think a really interesting change of mindset, I think that happened with Connecting Scotland was historically any project to kind of roll out a lot of devices for shared use or public use, people would have felt that was like really risky, and there would be this real worry that, well, what if people sewed them on or damaged them or whatever they might be. And I think what you're seeing across Connecting Scotland is people value them, you know, they've made a difference to their lives, they use them. And Jamie Trout, who's from the Sami community, he's not with us today, but he was recently talking about, you know, they did a project where they rolled out these devices, and because these were giving people capability in their lives, they weren't reappearing on eBay or disappearing in a way that you might expect them to. And I think that's quite a good kind of mindset shift of, you know, we don't need to be as risk averse as we might need to.
We've only lost one device as far as we are aware, and that's a young man whose puppy got a hold of it.
Oh, right.
So he didn't damage it deliberately.
Yeah. Okay. But yeah, very good. I realized we've gone, for some reason the clock on my computer has stopped. I'm not sure quite why that's happening. I realized we rode right through 11 o'clock, but it's been a lovely discussion. Thank you all for coming. And the report's online on our website. Have a look at it and tell us what you think. Thank you so much for joining us. And I hope you enjoy other Digital Leaders Week events if you go to them. So thanks again.
Thanks, John.
Bye.